Tonight we're going to be looking at the actual cultural institutions that constitute the various cycle of activities that are associated with any one particular culture. And I refer you back to the chart of cultural institutions that we first talked about when we started the class. We'll be looking at what is called production systems, as you see there on the board. Tonight, we're going to be talking about foraging cultures, slash and burn cultures, horticulture, intensive farming, mechanized farming, and pastoral lifestyles. We're going to be looking at the manner in which people are able to meet their food needs, their living requirements, off of the ecological conditions that are typical of their particular area. And tonight, we're going to begin with our discussion of the lifestyle of hunters and gatherers. And we're going to begin with the study of pastoralism. Then, after our break, we'll come back and look at the nature of agriculture and the lifestyle of people who do farming for a lifestyle. Now, I start with hunters and gatherers because, quite frankly, it is a lifestyle that has probably been with us for the longest period of time. I say that because, quite frankly, Adam and Eve, when they were placed in the garden, were living as a hunting and gathering lifestyle. The Adam and Eve were placed there. They were told that they could have anything that they needed from the garden. They could eat any of the fruit. They could eat any of the produce that God had placed there. That's basically what a hunting and gathering lifestyle is, or as it's sometimes known as a foraging lifestyle. It's a lifestyle in which people move from area to area. They will eat the fruits from the trees, the nuts from plants, the berries, dig up the tubers, eat the leaves, whatever it is that they find edible. And of course, after they started eating animals, they could, of course, begin to hunt and eat animals, birds, whatever other kind of sources of protein that they could get. This kind of lifestyle, frankly, existed or has existed all the way from the time of the Garden of Eden right up until the present. Now, I'm not going to begin to presume when God created Adam and Eve and placed them in the garden, it was at least 10,000 years ago, because we have evidence of gardening and of human existence back as far as 10,000 years. We have existence, or possible existence of human beings for a whole lot longer than that. But that gets us into all of the questions of the length of the earth and all of the geology and interpretation of dating mechanisms and all that. And we're not going to get into that. That's a debate that's best left alone for those of us who are looking for present living cultures. We're not going to try to examine that. But I would point out the fact that it has been a lifestyle that has existed for at least 10,000 years. And has continued right up to the present, so that into the very recent past, folk were living by this lifestyle. So it's been quite a sufficient lifestyle for small groups of people all around the globe. One of the questions that we want to ask tonight is, what kind of a lifestyle was it? And some folk have suggested that it was a lifestyle that was nasty, short, and brutish. Now, was it indeed a lifestyle that was nasty, short, and brutish? Was it a lifestyle in which folk lived in caves, carried big clubs, beat off huge prehistoric animals, saber-toothed tigers, grabbed women by their hair and dragged them back to their caves to be their paramours? Were they people who sat around eating their meat half raw because They didn't have fire. You know, just what kind of a lifestyle was it? And of course, it's difficult to know because we have so few clues as to the lifestyle of that people. But it is an interesting question, and I think it's one that bears looking into. A third question that we would want to ask is, what caused hunters and gatherers to give up their lifestyle? Why would they want to take up a lifestyle of farming? Was farming a marvelous advance forward? Was it the greatest invention of the human race? Was moving into cities, behind walls, a marvelous step forward? And those are a couple of the kinds of questions that we want to ask tonight in our lecture. So let's begin with the nature of life in a foraging culture. Let's ask ourselves, what was the social surrounding of foraging peoples? And the first thing that we want to note is that people tended to live in small bands in a hunting and gathering lifestyle. And there's a reason, of course, for this. If you're going to be living off of the wild turnips, or off of the berries, or off of the piñon nuts that fall from the pine trees, if you're going to be living off of the game that you can hunt, frankly, you need to be a fairly small group of people. Because if you have a large group of people, you immediately scare the game away, you immediately exhaust the resources that are available, and you're going to be in major trouble running out of food and having to move almost constantly. So, in a foraging culture, folk tended to live in small bands, couple, 3 families traveling together, moving into a region, digging up mongongo nuts, grabbing pine cones from the trees, roasting them, eating the berries, digging up whatever clams that you could find along the beach, or whatever the ecological resources of the region would sustain. At the very most, you would have maybe 4 or 5 families traveling together and living in this manner. A second characteristic is that it would be very, very mobile. That mobility would be necessitated by the constant need to move with the crops, move with the food. As a matter of fact, in North America, you have a definite north-south kind of migration pattern as people would move south and then move back north, depending on the winters, depending on how cold it got, depending on where they could move in conjunction with available food supplies, and also in respect to moving with the game. And you see this very, very dramatically in the story of dances with wolves, where they are constantly on the move following the buffalo, because it is survival from the buffalo that keeps them going. So they're constantly on the move. So mobility is a major part of their lifestyle. If you're going to have constant mobility, of course you're going to have a culture that doesn't have a lot of stuff to have to move. You don't build up a lot of material artifacts to carry with you. You don't have a lot of extra clothes. You don't have a lot of extra furniture. You tend to make do with everything that you can carry quite easily. And a third characteristic of foraging culture is their ability to meet occasionally for what the anthropologists in the literature call congregation and dispersal. And by congregation and dispersal, there are times when it's good for the whole, shall we say, tribe to get together, when all these little bands will finally come together for a short time of fellowship, of planning. This is a time when all of the leaders can come together and can reaffirm their solidarity as a tribe, when they can choose mutual leaders, when they can plan mutual strategies, when they can talk about their mutual defense, when they can come to the defense of their territory if there is the threat against them by an outside tribe. It is a time when they can fellowship, when they can engage in spiritual worship. It's a time when they can talk with folk who are family members, but who are become associated with other clans. And it's also a time when their young people can begin to gather for the purpose of finding spouses, husbands, and wives. So it's a time of courtship, time of sharing of news, and of getting acquainted. But because they would quickly exhaust the resources of a region, they also need to disperse again, and so they will do that. It is, fourthly then, a culture in which both men and women share in the collection of food. The men are the hunters, and the women are the gatherers. Quite typically, the men bring in game that has been killed. Women bring in the plants that they've dug up, or the berries that they've gathered, or the nuts that have been gathered, and they'll pool it. They generally will live in a very communal type of setting, so they will generally share food, and everybody contributes to the resources necessary for a particular group of people. Now, giving these broad parameters of what life is like in a band society, let's take a look at the manner in which they meet various kinds of requirements. Let's begin first by looking at the manner in which they are able to meet their need for food. Now, since we're not able to go back in time and find out how prehistoric hunters and gatherers or foragers were able to live, we really have to look at existing societies that continue to live by a foraging lifestyle. So an anthropology team by the name of Lee's, a husband and wife team, went to the Kalahari Desert to study the Kungsan people. The Kungsan people were a group of desert dwellers, and you would probably know these desert dwellers if you're any kind of a movie buff. If you went to see the film The Gods Must Be Crazy, and if you go see the Gods Must Be Crazy, okay, Gods Must Be Crazy. That group of people are the Kungsan. And of course that movie is, I mean, the reason that it's such a classic movie is because it takes a stereotype of what a tribal or a hunting and gathering group should be, you know, nice, peaceful, coexistent, docile, non-conflict oriented type of group, and living out there. And of course, as you know the film, the Coke bottle drops in, all of a sudden they start fighting over the Coke bottle, and the leader of the Kungsan decides that he's got to get rid of the Coke bottle, so he's going to go drop it off at the edge of the world. And so off he starts on his journey, and you know all of the marvelous things that happens as he meets the guy studying elephant behavior, and on and on and on it goes. Well, okay, what about this lifestyle of the Kungsan? What is it like really? And of course that movie portrayed it in very, very fantasy-oriented kinds of characteristics, which makes it all the more funny for anyone who really knows what the lifestyle was like. But what was it like for them? The men, of course, did all the hunting. And the men would sometimes go off on a hunting trip that would last 8, 9, 10, 11 days, come back with a large selection of meat. Sometimes they would come back with nothing. Sometimes they would simply go out for a day of hunting, come back with very little. Sometimes they were successful, sometimes they weren't. This is one of the things about having an existence where you depend upon your own prowess. You sometimes have a lot of meat, sometimes you have very little meat. It's not like you could run down to Lucky's and buy it in a cellophane plastic wrapper every day after work. So they had meat when they had it, and the men had to be very diligent in constantly hunting. But when they were hunting, what the Lees found out was that a male hunter could supply 800 calories of meat for every band member for every hour that he spent in hunting. And he followed them. He counted the number of hours that they spent in hunting and weighed the amount of meat that they brought back and calculated the amount of calories. And so this was the conclusion that he came up with. He also then sent his wife to watch over what the women were doing. And what they discovered was that women who were out gathering food and nuts were able to supply about 2,000 calories for every band member for every hour that they spent gathering food and nuts. So the men are contributing from their meat, the women are contributing from their gathering. So then he put together what a diet should consist of for a Kung San person. And what he discovered was that if they had a diet consisting of 9 ounces of mongongo nuts and meat, that this would provide them with 2,140 calories with 92.6 grams of protein. Now, you're aware, of course, if you've been into any kind of nutrition studies, that we have to have a balance of calories and protein in order to keep these old bodies of ours percolating along at a normal functioning rate. He then calculated how much daily nutrition a Kung San person would need. And he came to the conclusion that their daily minimum requirements were at least 1,975 calories and 60 grams of protein. That means that their daily minimum need for calories, proteins, could be met with a fairly small supply of mongongo nuts and meat. As a matter of fact, for the whole tribe, or for the whole band, an hour of, or not an hour, but say a day of hunting, a day of gathering, could provide enough food for the whole band for a couple of days. There was apparently an adequate supply of food without excessive labor involved. So then he looked into the whole question of what about workload? If their food requirements could be easily met, what would be the result of their work requirement upon them? So again, looking at the lifestyle of the Kung San, and remember now, these are people who live on the border of the Kalahari Desert. This is probably one of the harshest regions of the world. These are a people who are having to probably spend the maximum amount of time. These are not people who are living in luxury kinds of ecological settings such as you would find up in, say, Washington or Oregon. But these are folk who live in a very harsh part of the world. And what he discovered was that for the adults, and in the Kung San community that he was working with, 60% of the population of the Kung San were adults. The other 40% were children. He discovered that the average workload for the adults was 15 to 17 hours a week. So 15 to 17 hours per week for the adults. What about the kids? Well, the kids and the older folk were not required to spend any time contributing to the needs of the community. The kids were free to go hunting if they wanted, to go play if they wanted, to practice with their bows and arrows, if they would set a trap. And from that trap, they were able to catch a bird or a mongoose or any other kind of an animal. They could add it to the rest of the food for the community, but it wasn't a necessity that was required of them. And the old men or the old women could sit around repairing their little shelters, fixing a new bowstring, fashioning a new arrow, doing whatever they needed to do, babysitting with the kids. Their work was not necessary for the rest of the community. So they could spend, in addition to the 15 to 17 hours per week, all the rest of the time that was available to them for socialization. Fathers could spend time with their children. Men could spend time with their wives. Women could spend time talking with one another. Men could spend time just enjoying their environment. So in terms of workload, not half bad. Now, let me compare this lifestyle now with your normal lifestyle here at Biola. Now, as an undergraduate, you are taking, what, maybe 18 hours of coursework per semester? Graduates, we don't recommend that you take more than 12 because we throw a lot more work onto you. See? But let's work with about 18 hours of work. You are spending as much time in class per week as an undergraduate as a Kung San has to spend for his entire week to meet all of his needs. And of course, you've got to do more than just sit in class. See? Now, if I understand correctly, we are supposed to ask you, prepare assignments, reading, writing assignments that will keep you busy about 2 hours for every hour you spend in class. You're aware of that, aren't you? So, for every hour you spend in class, we give you 2 hours of reading and writing assignments, which means that we now have 18 hours, plus 18 hours, plus 18 hours more. So, what are we up to? We're up there to a fair few hours. You are up to now 3 times the normal workload of a hunter and gatherer. And that's not enough. See, we charge you for the privilege of coming here and suffering under our direction. And some of you come from families that are not independently wealthy. Your last name is not Gates, and your father's name is not Bill. So you're here, and your parents are saying, look, we'll pay tuition. You've got to pay for your own personal expenses. See? So some of you are having to work. And we suggest that you only work, because we don't want to overload you, 18 to 20 hours a week, right? You are now working 4 times as hard to go to Biola as a hunter and gatherer has to work to survive in the harsh, brutal, savage environment of a foraging culture. You got 4 times the stress, 4 times the demand. You are working probably close to 60 hours a week, and thankful that you can be here. Right? Thankful to your parents, thankful to us teachers for the privilege, see, of driving you to a 60-hour work week, when in point of fact, if you could live with a Kung San, you'd be sitting around roasting peanuts every evening, see, swapping stories, see, about the lizard that got away, I mean, it's a whole entirely different lifestyle. And I've seen that change, you see, because I did all of my studies, my graduate studies, during furloughs. See, I'd come home after 4 years on the mission field, go to a year of school, intense studies, 60 hours a week of graduate studies, doing deputation on the weekends, raising money for my mission, representing my church, taking care of my family, working till I could hardly stand up, and then boom, back on the airplane, back overseas, and back to the slow pace, see, of a tribal society. And I remember thinking 2 weeks after I had left my last final exam here in this country, and I'm back on the field, and I'm sitting in a Donny house. My boots are hanging up over the rafters, drying out. It's raining outside, nice big warm fire there, and we're roasting peanuts, and I'm sitting there chatting and thinking, oh man, I don't ever want to go back to the U.S. Who would ever want to give this up? And we're having a grand time and cracking peanuts and eating them and roasting them in the fire and talking about the day's activities and talking about the trail, talking about things of the Lord. A marvelous lifestyle. Well, was it all that wonderful? What about health? Was it an unhealthy existence? So let's ask one more question about health. Now, I'll have to admit, this is one of the unsavory parts of living in a hunting and gathering society. It's one of the unsatisfactory aspects of any kind of life before modern medicine. I remember my first entrance into a village. I was the first outsider to come into the village. We walked into the village, and sores and tropical ulcers and malnourishment. I mean, it was pitiful. Kids hanging there on their parents' hips, untreated wounds all over the place, no medicine of any sort, and we would spend several hours every day treating people's wounds and giving penicillin shots. I learned to give basic shots, even learned to give myself shots in the old hip when I was out in the, oh man, I'm sick too, trying to give the old shot, And that's kind of an interesting experience, to jab that old needle into your own posterior. But without medicine, life is pretty gruesome. And I don't know that anybody would want to go back to that. But was it all that bad? Well, let me go again to the figures that the Lees came up with. They discovered that on the basis of what they saw of the Kung San people, that 10% of the population was over 60 years of age. And one of the things that Lee did was remind us to take a good, careful look at what life was like in these kinds of environments. Not everybody died at an early age. Now, the death rate was indeed fairly staggering. But when do people die? What are the statistics on people's death rates? The death rates tend to be the very early periods of life, the first 5 years of life. As a matter of fact, as we were doing statistics on the Donny population, we discovered that over half of the children died before the age of 5. This was when the period when they were most vulnerable. Now, do you know what's the chief killer of babies in the third world? Anybody here who's into world nutrition? What was it? No, it's not malnutrition. Almost. It's diarrhea. Diarrhea kills most of the kids. They get a little infection, they get their diet off a little bit, mother's milk dries up, or they're having a hard time nursing, or something happens. They'll get a bad case of diarrhea, and they'll dehydrate, and they just don't have the resources to fight off the ravages of the dehydration. And the interesting thing is that dehydration can be solved so very, very easily with a little sugar water. It doesn't take a lot of money to stop diarrhea, and it's one of the great tragedies that so many thousands of children die every day when all it takes is some sugar water to take care of them. Well, that's when kids die. That's when the population dies off, and that pulls your statistics down. If you've got half of the population dying before the age of 5, it pulls your survival statistics down very, very dramatically. Once you make it past the age of 5, it's a fairly easy thing then to survive into your adult years. You get into your adult years, what's the chief killer of people from the ages of 18 to 38? Chief killer of people from 18 to 38 is other people. Warfare. So if you can keep from getting killed by your neighbors, or if you can keep from fighting in deadly warfare, you're probably going to make it. We had very, very few people who died as a result of accidents. I mean, we did have accidents, no question about it. We had a couple of young people who were up hunting and got caught in a rainstorm, sat underneath a big tree to escape the rain, and the tree got zapped by lightning and they got fried at the base of it. You know, unfortunate. We've had people, one poor guy was climbing up a tree, he'd shot a possum, and the possum got hooked on a branch, and so he had to climb up the tree to get it off the branch. And as he was climbing up, he lost his grip and started to slide down, and as he slid down, he had a big bush knife, and the bush knife slipped out and got into his hand, and his hand slid over the bush knife and just gashed his hand wide open. And they had no way to stop the bleeding, and so the poor man bled to death. And you know, these kinds of tragedies do happen, and we've been at these funerals and mourned with these kinds of people, but they're not excessive kinds of deaths. The major killer was other people. So folk were living well into their 60s because, you see, diseases that normally ravage populations have to ravage populations after they travel from one group to another. And the characteristic of band societies has been that they live in isolation. And so when they live in isolation, diseases did not readily transmit from one group to another, so they were not introduced to the major diseases that have ravaged the world. You probably live in a more disease-infected environment than most tribal folk have ever lived. We have worse infectious diseases today than have ever existed in the history of humanity. The only thing that saves us is that we've got scientists who are trying to stay desperately one step ahead of the mutating diseases that are trying to overcome the diseases that, or the medicines that we have developed. Well, let's look a little bit more systematic at this whole question of what is life like in a foraging culture. Let's look at three categories: biological requirements for survival, psychological requirements for survival, and the social cultural requirements for survival. Let's see how well a hunting and gathering society can meet each one of these three basic components. Let's look at the biological first of all. They've got to have food. We've already talked about food. They can have the basic requirements of food quite easily. Maximum 15 to 17 hours of work per week. Sexual activity, you've got to have enough sexual activity to ensure that there is a growth rate that exceeds the death rate, so that every couple, husband and wife, has to have at least 2 children to maintain the survival rate. Those 2 children have to be able to grow up to adults. So if every couple has at least 3 children, one of whom may die somewhere along the line, you have at least the ability to reproduce. And the reproduction rates that have been studied of virtually all tribal people have indicated that reproduction does indeed continue at least at a minimum of 3 surviving people per couple. So as long as that's taking place, there is enough sexual activity. Now we could say something here about never getting enough sex, but we won't do that. You know, some guys simply couldn't get enough of anything. But at least for reproductive purposes. Warmth. You've got to have enough warmth. We've discovered that folk living in nomadic, pastoral, hunting and gathering cultures, even in the coldest environment, have been able to find enough warmth. They are able to make the adjustment so that folk, even living in the Arctic region, can make igloos out of ice and be able to be quite warm and quite comfortable. You go down to the Tierra del Fuego people, and they could run around bare naked at the very tip of South America and not be cold. Now, they develop a tremendous capacity. There's no question about it. The rest of us wouldn't be able to run around down there without clothes. We'd be chilled to the bone. But you can develop tremendous adaptation to extremes of weather and find ways to get warm. Now, as we were in Irian Jaya, my son came home for a holiday, and we decided we wanted to do something special. So we decided we were going to climb Mount Juliana, which is the third highest mountain in Irian Jaya. So we'd heard that there was a way to get up to the summit without having to go up the face of the cliff, which is what the mountain climbers wanted to do. We figured we'd slip up the backside. So we did. We worked our way up there. But we were getting up to the base camp when a chilly, chilly rain began to enfold us. And there was still another several hours we wanted to go. But while my son and I had clothes on, the carriers that were walking with us didn't. And, I mean, they just got downright cold. So they said, oh, you know, it's cold, it's raining, we've got to stop a bit early. Do you mind if we build a fire? So we did. We stopped, we built a fire, built a little bit of a shelter, and they warmed up, and we let the drizzle stop, and once it stopped, off we went. And ultimately made it to the base camp where we were going to stop for the night. And the next day we walked on up to the top of Mount Juliana. Now, Mount Juliana is snow-covered year-round. And here, my son and I are up there. He's got his jacket on with his American flag sewn into the back of it, and I'm taking pictures, and we've got nice warm clothes on, and our carriers are running around in the snow, see, with no shoes, no socks, no nothing. See? Now, you know, they were horribly vulnerable, and we knew it, and we knew that they could end up with frostbite and all that sort of stuff. So we quickly got off of there so that we wouldn't expose them to undue dangers. But they had developed a tremendous capacity for short bursts of exposure to the cold, and they could take it much more rigorously than we could. Health. We've already talked about the health requirements. They are vulnerable. The jungle is unforgiving, but if you're careful, if you take care of things, the body has marvelous healing abilities, and will do everything it can to work with you if you work with it. In terms of rest, we've already talked about how they have to work just 17 hours a week. And in terms of protection, of course, they've had to work very, very hard to protect themselves against the elements, against animals, and against one another. And if these things can be taken care of, their biological needs are met. What about the psychological needs? Well, they have the same basic needs that we have. They have a need for love. They have a need for acceptance. They have a need for dignity. They have a need for a little bit of humor. They need low stress. And they need a sense of purpose and achievement in life. Can they get that in a hunting and gathering society? Well, quite frankly, what you have on a regular basis is a small family band traveling together. And when you have a family band traveling together, you have tremendous internal acceptance. After all, this is mom and dad and the kids are traveling together. And they develop a tremendous tolerance for one another. One of the things that the Lees found when they went hunting with the Kung San was that they did not criticize somebody when they missed a shot. When they were hunting for the giraffes, if a shot went a bit high, nobody said, oh, you dumb jerk, look, you missed that shot, I'll be the one that does it next, I'm the better hunter. Everybody was accepted for what they were. They learned to accept one another's strengths and abilities. They learned who was good at various things, and they allowed them to do that because every member had to become a protective partner in the total needs of the community. And if anybody was excluded or made fun of, or if their accomplishments were not fully appreciated, then you diminish the capacity of the whole group to survive. So they developed strategies, see, for incorporating the strengths and building to those strengths. So there was love and acceptance and dignity, and they would laugh. They developed a tremendous sense of humor. And this is, of course, one of the reasons. I mean, it's all these psychological components of the life of the Kung San that becomes in the basis for that movie about the gods must be crazy. Well, what about socio-cultural? There's the need for education. There's the need for leadership. There's the need for harmony. there's the need for stability, and there's the need for the care of the members of the society. Well, how do you do education in a band society? You do education by watching others do what needs to be done. You learn to go hunting by watching Dad hunt. You learn how to dig up mongongo nuts by watching Mother dig up mongongo nuts. You learn about the ways of nature by lying in the grass and watching how nature carries out its cycle of life. Children go out in small hunting groups. They have their little bows and arrows. They shoot into anthills. They shoot at imaginary targets. They may even begin to start shooting at small creatures, beetles, you know, start shooting arrows into little beetles. And they perfect their hunting abilities, their stalking abilities. And they learn from one another. They critique one another so that children then become the educators of one another. And the same thing with the care of children. See, young girls begin to take care of their younger brothers or younger sisters, and they learn how to keep a child from being unhappy, from developing sores, from being sickly. So, education continues. Leadership is given by family members. Harmony is established by a variety of techniques, depending on the nature of the band. And stability is somehow brought together because survival is necessary and folk realize that they must come into harmony together. Now, we come back to our question. Hunting and gathering. Was a foraging lifestyle nasty, short, and brutish? That was our original question. We've looked at the evidence. What do we conclude? Now, I presented to you a picture of what life might have been like. Would we say it's nasty, short, and brutish? Well, I would trust that you would come to the conclusion, no. It wasn't particularly nasty, short, and brutish. By the same token, would you describe it as an affluent lifestyle? And I think our answer would have to be, no, it's not an affluent lifestyle. There is very little variation in the food. You're eating berries until you can't stand another blueberry. You are eating piñon nuts until you wish you'd never have another piñon nut. You are eating sweet potatoes morning, noon, and night until you can't stand the thought of stuffing another sweet potato in. There's no variety. There's no, hey, let's go out for Mexican tonight. No, I want to do Chinese takeout, you know. None of that. There's no variety, no amenities. Well, I think I'll wear a red tie, you know, nice big flashy red tie today. No. You have one set of clothes, you wear it till it falls off your back, and then you try to make yourself another one. There are no material goods. There's very little stylishness. Oh, you know, people can get stylish, but, you know, how stylish can you get? You know, you can stick a feather in your head. Big deal, you know. You can make a nice band to go around there, and, you know, that's exciting. And indeed we do. You know, we just have this uncontrollable desire to flash ourselves up, you know, to put something decorative on our bodies. We have this creative impulse, this aesthetic impulse, if you would. And so you do that, but it's fairly limited. And there's not an awful lot of opportunity for self-expression. So it wasn't an affluent lifestyle. Nobody had art on the walls. Well, they had some drawings on their caves, but, you know, nobody had a nice ocean scene, see, up there in a picture frame. So what we can say about that lifestyle was that it was an adequate lifestyle. And it was adequate as long as the population and resources stayed in balance. as long as population and resources stayed in balance. Now, why did foragers abandon this particular lifestyle? Why would they give it up if it's such a wonderful lifestyle? You know, lying around, shall we go hunting today? Nah, we still got meat from yesterday. Okay, let's just kind of hang around here all day today. What would change them to say, hey, you know what, I think I'm going to get up and work myself into a real sweat planting corn today? Why would you want to do that? I just feel like it. No, you know, what was it that would give them motivation to spend hours of backbreaking labor planting food in a garden? Well, again, we are unable to answer that question because we can't go back in time. All we can do is look at the manner in which current cultures are making the transition from hunting and gathering to horticultural lifestyle. And the first thing that we notice is that gardening and planting do become introduced strategies. And we saw this among the Duvalay and Iao peoples in Irian Jaya. Here were a people who would travel up and down the rivers, fishing, hunting, gathering breadfruit from the trees, gathering other kinds of fruit from the trees, and they would travel over extensive areas getting this food. But there would be occasions when they wouldn't feel like traveling. Somebody might be sick in the band. A woman might be ready to give child. And so they would stay in one of these dwellings alongside the river. And as they would spend longer times at some of these dwellings, they would cut down the local trees in order to have firewood to cook their food. Eventually they would create a small clearing around that house, and it was a temptation in the midst of that clearing to, say, plant some banana bushes, to become a banana tree, or to plant your own breadfruit tree, or to plant something else that was a food-bearing plant. So that as you would be traveling the river, you'd say, hey, you know what, if we travel a little bit further tonight, we can make it to so-and-so camp, and there should be some bananas ripe there for us. Oh, okay, let's do that. And so you would pull in, and sure enough, boom, there is your food all ready for you. You know that it's there because you planted it, and it has finally come to full season. So gardening and planting was introduced as a kind of casual byproduct simply of a people who were horticulturally sensitive to their environment. Well, it doesn't take long before hunting rights then quickly turn into land rights. You see, typically people who are hunting and gathering people look at a territory not in terms of ownership of the territory, but in terms of the right to hunt in that territory. And indeed, they can get into arguments with anybody who comes hunting in their territory. This is our territory to hunt. But they never had planting rights. But once you start planting plants, once you start taking care of trees, oh, this is a great breadfruit tree, but you know what? Possum are crawling up there eating all of my breadfruit. So you put a little barrier around the trunk of the tree so that the possum climb up and they get stuck. They can't get past the barrier. Sort of like squirrel barriers that you'd see up in the mountains here, where they put aluminum around the tree so that the squirrels can't climb up the pine trees and chew the pine nuts down and let them fall on your cars in the parking lot. Well, tribal people do the same thing. They build these little puggy, or calling it by its tribal term, these little possum barriers so that the possum can't climb up the trees. And once they've done that, they've kind of laid claim to that tree. This is my tree. I'm taking care of it. Nobody else can eat from this tree because it's now my tree. And so hunting rights became land rights. And once these land rights began to take over, people took a proprietary interest in the land. Probably more importantly, though, there was a decrease in the amount of food and game that was available. As food and game began to diminish, it was necessary for them to begin to plant more food that they could rely on, plus there was the necessity for them to have a more stable supply of meat by having domesticated animals. So then comes the next problem, of course, and that is that there is the increase in population. As the population begins to grow, as there are more and more mouths to feed, there is the need for more food, more stable supply of food, and this requires then the greater use of controlled garden supplies to feed the group. Well, this is quite typical then of the lifestyle of hunting and gathering people. Let's go on to look at pastoral nomads. And there are a number of regions of the world in which pastoral nomadism takes place. Your textbook has a marvelous section on this and points out the fact that pastoral nomads live in the northern regions where they take care of reindeer, in Central Asia where they take care of horses, yaks, and sheep. They live in North Africa and the Middle East where they take care of sheep, goats, and camels. And then you move down into Central and South Africa with cattle. And in recent years, in North America, there was the whole use of buffalo, cattle, and sheep. Now, there are a couple of characteristics about nomads. Nomadism has not been a particularly popular lifestyle. And there's a reason for that. Because you cannot live off of animals alone. Pastoral societies tend to be what we call mixed societies. You have to live off of both the produce of your animals, but you also have to live off of garden supplies. Somebody has to plant gardens, or if you don't do it in your own group, you then have to buy from people who are gardeners. And so in the mixed economy, what you do is you go to trade fairs and you buy vegetables and produce from people who live in cities. It is also a lifestyle that is nomadic or semi-nomadic. That means you travel constantly to be with your flocks as they go to pasture lands. And it is also a lifestyle that only exists in ecologically marginal zones. It is a lifestyle that takes place where gardens usually are not capable of sustaining lifestyle. So it's at the very high altitudes, up in the mountains, or in high steppe areas where the weather is far too intolerable for crops, where animals can handle what is happening. It is also a lifestyle that gives itself to long-distance trade. Since you're traveling anyway, the idea is we might as well be able to carry stuff. And since you're having to buy food in the marketplace, why not buy some cloth or some other goods, carry it on your pack animals, carry it to the next place, trade those along with your animals, and be able to live off of a trading lifestyle. It is also a lifestyle that is reputed to be very aggressive and warlike. And of course there's a reason for that. Because you see that group of people who are living out there, no fixed base, constantly on the move. They are constantly vulnerable to attacks by people from other areas who would be hostile toward them. And it is necessary for them to defend themselves. And so they've developed a very aggressive and warlike stance. But apart from these, it is a lifestyle that allows people to live in regions that would normally be totally uninhabitable by other forms of lifestyle. And with that, we come to an end, actually. But we just want to make one final point. It is a lifestyle that focuses on harmony with nature. All of these, pastoralism, or whether it is hunting and gathering, are a people who must be in harmony with the cycles of nature. And in being in harmony with nature, they find themselves much more attuned to the rhythms of life.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.